All right, you guys have seen enough of my face today, so I hid myself. But we're going to do the last two exercises here on this list of possible topics that you could see or ways that I could test about duality on the exam. Knowing that I'm testing about duality is a very straightforward thing to see. I'm going to use this next one as an example. You see here, we're talking about testing hypotheses, right? And then in the same question, we all of a sudden start talking about confidence intervals. That's immediately how you know this is a duality question. This question just comes down to that idea that if our P naught is outside, it's the same thing as us saying reject the null in a hypothesis test. Inside being fail to reject the null, and that our confidence level is just 1 minus our significance level, that these two things are complements of one another. So we got all of this stuff to help us out. If you haven't tried this question on your own, I strongly recommend you pause the video and take a whirl. Now, in this question, we have a p-value, unlike the previous one where we didn't know what our p-value was. And we want to know what is going to be true about our confidence interval. So how I handle this particular question is I like to put everything in the same framework, because going back and forth between confidence intervals and hypothesis testing is hard on our brains. So for me, the easiest thing to do is to put everything in hypothesis testing framework. So all three of these questions say will not include. And in each of them, we are given a confidence level. So if we want to put these all into hypothesis testing, we could be able to write out three different alphas, right? For 99%, it's 0.01. For 95%, it's 0.05. For 90%, it's 0.10. And will not include means it's outside. We would reject the null. So all we need to do on this question, and I say that like it's super easy, but that's because I've done a bunch of these and I wrote the question. All we need to do is look at our p-value, 0.06, and see how it compares to that alpha. So in this case, our 0.06 is greater. The only time it's less than is in our last example. And then we're going to say, oh, here's where we reject the null, right? P-value's low, reject the ho. The answer has to be C. In the other two examples, we would have failed to reject the null. In the next exercise, again, I strongly recommend pausing, try it on your own. I'll give you a hint though, it's very similar to the first one. So if you've come back, again, we see confidence intervals, we see stuff about testing, so we know it's another duality question. And again, I like to put everything into hypothesis testing framework. So all of our answer choices are already about hypothesis testing, but the information given was about a confidence interval. So what I would do is I'd go ahead, let's convert this 95%. We know that that's an alpha of 0.05. Let's look at that outside inside. We can see 0.4 would fall outside of our interval. So if it's outside, we would reject the null. So now we have everything in a hypothesis testing framework. We know we rejected the null with a hypothesis test of 0.05. And that's what we hope to look for in our answer choices. We see C says we would, oh, boo. And none of these other ones mention our alpha level, which is where things get a little sticky, right? So this question, though, is just like the one we did in 6.5.3. We may not know exactly what our p-value is, but since we rejected the null, it must be less than 0.05. Which means if we up our p-value to 0.10 to 10%, we would still reject the null because our p-value is smaller than our original, and we're just making it easier to reject the null. So the correct answer choice here is D. B is the one that we saw up in part D of the previous example, where we could not, we don't really know what's happening. So if that didn't make sense, just rewatch the video on 6.5.3, and that'll help out.